Just in time. There we go.
Good morning, everyone. Well, it's now 9:30 and it's time to open the hearing session for matter 4 today, which concerns the district spatial strategy. My name is Phil Milam and my colleague is Kevin Ward. We are inspectors appointed by the Secretary of State under Section 20 of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004 to carry out the independent examination of the Folkestone and Hythe core strategy review. As you probably already know, the programme officer for the examination is Caroline Williams, and she'll be present for all of the hearing sessions. Caroline, can you see and hear me okay?
Yes, everything's fine. Thank you, Mr. Milam.
Thank you. So as Caroline has probably indicated to you as you've joined through the lobby, we'd prefer it if everyone could keep their cameras on so that we're able to see everyone on screen, but have your microphone switched to mute unless you're speaking. However, if for any reason you don't want to keep your camera on all the time, please turn it on when you're speaking, or if you just want to make your contribution without having the camera on, that's also absolutely fine as well. So before we proceed with the opening announcements, it would be useful, I think, firstly for the council's representatives and then the other participants to come in and introduce themselves. And this will just help to confirm that everyone can be seen and heard. So if we can start by asking the council's representatives to introduce yourselves one by one, obviously unmute your microphone and then mute it again when you've spoken.
So good morning. My name is Paul Shedder-Revian QC and I'm representing the council.
Good morning.
Hello, my name's Adrian Toffs and I'm lead specialist on policy matters at Folkestone and Hythe District Council.
Good morning again, Mr. Toffs.
Hello, I'm Rebecca Chittock and I'm a planning policy specialist.
Thank you. Is that everyone from the council's team? Well, I noticed we've got one or two others. Is that principally everyone from the council's team who's going to be speaking during the session?
Yes, that's right, actually. Thank you. Unless Mr. Honey has an opportunity to say something.
Of course, yes. Mr. Honey, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Jesse Honey. I'm an Associate Director at ACOM and I'm also a Planning Policy Specialist.
Thank you. So moving on, I've got a participants electronic list down the side. So if I come next to Mr. Waterhouse.
Good morning, James Waterhouse from Iceni Projects representing Quinn Estates.
Good morning again, Mr. Waterhouse. Ms. Miller.
Good morning, I'm Katie Miller. I'm Planning Manager with the Kent Downs Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty Unit.
Thank you. Next on my list, I think I've got Miss Barton. I think you might still be on mute, Miss Barton. There you are.
My name's Louise Martin and I'm a local Romilly Marsh resident and represent Lid Airport Action Group.
Thank you. I've got, I think next on my list is Miss Carmody Morgan. Morgan, sorry, apologies.
No problem. Yes, it's Poppy Carmody Morgan from Quad representing Otterpool Park LP.
Thank you, I will get that right.
No problem.
I've got a Mr. Scoffham, or is it Dr. Is it Dr. Scoffham?
Good morning, everybody. Yeah, Dr. Stephen Scoffham. I'm representing ACRIS Parish Meeting, and I'm an academic based at Canterbury Christchurch University, specialising in sustainability and education. And I hope you'll keep me on track, as it were, but I'm looking forward to participating for the first time in a public inquiry.
Thank you. I think that's covered everyone. I think I've probably got on my list in terms of who's speaking. So have I missed anyone? Of course, my tiles of, I can see all of you in little tiles in front of me. So no, I think that's got everyone this morning. Splendid. So just to remind everyone that the guidance notes that we issued back in May set out the background to the examination and the hearings, and all of the documents relevant to the examination are available on the council's website. The guidance notes for these virtual hearings were issued recently, and please bear these in mind along with the privacy notice. An agenda has been produced for the hearing session and hopefully you've all got a copy. And what we're going to do is work through the agenda in order. So please wait until the appropriate agenda item to make your points. And once we've dealt with a particular issue, we will move on and we won't be returning to it. So I'll give people plenty of opportunity, but please make sure you cover your points at the appropriate time. Please also be as focused as you can while speaking, and please don't feel the need to just simply agree with other speakers or repeat points that you've already made. We've got quite a lot to get through, and we've got a fair number of participants to have in this environment, so we want to make the best use of the time available. Now, as we go through the session, we'll be directing questions to the council, but we will give others a full opportunity to speak in relation to the representations you have respectively made in the core strategy review. And then we'll probably ask the council to respond on particular points at the end of those before we move on to the next item. Just again, a reminder, please only speak when you're asked to do so. As you've probably got the form by now, please unmute your microphone when speaking, but otherwise have it muted during the hearing, and we'll only have one participant speaking at a time. So if you wish to speak on any particular item, please use the raise hand facility that you've probably all tested thoroughly by now. And obviously, please make sure you take the raise hand function down when you've made your points. And obviously, do be patient. I can see the list of hands raised in order, so I will come to everyone during the session. And for another warning is please don't attempt to introduce or share documents via the Zoom facility, and please do not use the chat function. If we require any additional documents during the session, we will ask for them, and they should be emailed to the programme officer separately. If you have any technical difficulties or lose your connection and can't resolve the issue, please contact the programme officer by phone or email for assistance, and we'll do our best to make sure we get you back and connected and into the session. And please can you also ensure that phones or other mobile devices are either switched off or onto silent during the hearing sessions. And you may also find it helpful to reduce the amount of devices you have on Wi-Fi and things like that, particularly when there's a lot of participants on the meeting. We will take regular breaks during proceedings. So at that point, if you can turn your camera off and mute your microphone, but stay logged into the meeting session. And then obviously when the appropriate time comes to resume, please make sure that you're ready promptly to start at that time. As Caroline's probably already mentioned, that all of the hearing sessions are being streamed live on the council's YouTube channel, and that can be accessed via the link on the council's website, and that's up and running as I speak. So before we proceed in terms of the main agenda, are there any other queries from anyone in terms of procedural format or functions of Zoom that anyone wants to ask now before we get going? I see no hands, so you're all thoroughly practiced and well versed in Zoom, which is splendid. So without further ado, we'll perhaps move straight on to the main body of the agenda. The first item is related to policy SS1 and the district spatial strategy, and the council has already provided to us inspectors detailed responses to our matters, issues and questions on this matter, and I've taken that as read. There will be some further questions for the council. And I think what I also want to say is that at this point, this first part of the discussion is going to be focused at quite a high level on the district scale strategy overall. I'm mindful that the way that the document has been produced is that there are a number of character areas, and there are also going to be separate dedicated sessions for each of those where we'll go into even further detail. So this session is going to be perhaps at quite a high level in terms of that overall spatial strategy. So there is going to be a considerable amount of time devoted to each of those different areas as we go through the rest of the examination. So my sort of first sort of agenda item was talking about the overall spatial distribution of development across the district, and there are a number of sort of sub points that we want to cover throughout that. So from the council's perspective, I think it's fair to say that whilst we're focusing sort of predominantly on SS1 at the moment, the strategy overall is probably built up principally of policies SS1, SS2 and SS3, and we are, as I say, going to come and work through the rest of those policies as we go along. But I suppose my sort of opening sort of question for the council is, can you just take me through how the spatial strategy at the district scale was derived and the steps you took in sort of developing that strategy and the evidence which is informed and underpinned it? I'm not sure who's going to be kicking off for the council.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the policy SS1 is largely unchanged from the 2013 core strategy, but it is refocused on the North Downs area. When we began the core strategy review, higher housing figures were coming to us from the strategic housing market assessment and changes to government guidance. We commissioned ACOM to undertake a high-level landscape appraisal of the whole district, looking in great detail at separate character areas within the district, and that took as its starting point existing national landscape areas and county and local landscape areas, and produced a new report that updated those. That fed into the growth options study phase 1 that looked at the entire district in 6 character areas: the Kent Downs, Folkestone, Hythe, Sellinge and surrounding area, Romney Marsh and Walham Marsh, and Lydd, New Romney and Dungeness. Those 6 areas were looked at in more detail as regards a number of factors, including environmental constraints, transport and accessibility, geo-environmental considerations, infrastructure, landscape and topography, heritage, housing demand, regeneration potential, economic development potential, and spatial opportunities and constraints. It's obvious from this work that the district is a constrained area, with large areas being within the Kent Downs area of outstanding natural beauty, large areas of high flood risk on Romney Marsh, and also, of course, international designations for wildlife around Dungeness. The results of the ACOM work was that the only area that was offered, that was identified for potential, was in the North Downs area, and that formed the focus for the phase 2 work. That looked at more detail at that particular area identified by phase 1, and similar factors were applied to that, breaking it down into a series of smaller sub-areas. And from that, the spatial strategy was derived, and that is reflected in the updates to policy SS1.
Thank you, Mr. Toff. So, in essence, is it a sort of I sort of started with a sort of fairly core sieving exercise based on the principal constraints, rather than built up in perhaps a different way, looking at other factors. So you sort of layered on those constraints and found out where might have some potential for future expansion.
It did look very thoroughly at constraints throughout the district, but also areas of opportunity, sort of regeneration potential and areas like that. Some of the areas that might offer opportunity were themselves highly developed already, because areas like Folkestone and Hythe, where although sort of well connected or in transport terms or with employment opportunities, where they were already highly developed, and work ongoing through the Places and Policies local plan had already identified a number of development sites within those areas. So it was a combination of opportunities and sieving.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think that I was sort of going to come on to that, because what I want to understand in a bit more detail is how the evidence base looked at infrastructure capacity the potential for economic growth and supporting local regeneration, and how these particular points were built in to building up that strategy. So can you perhaps outline a bit more about how those factors in particular were considered as part of your assessment of the overall district strategy?
Yeah, I think if I could bring in my colleague Jessie Honey from ACOM at this point, who can give more information on those aspects.
Thank you.
Thank you. I assume, am I allowed to unmute myself now then?
You are indeed.
Good. Right, yes, thank you, Adrian. So I just wanted to make a couple of points before turning to the infrastructure and the opportunities point that you made, Inspector. The point I was going to make to supplement what Adrian said is that clearly the ACOM study came into, to some extent, a pre-existing planning context. It was certainly not a kind of entire blank sheet of paper, and that's clearly stated in the study where it's noted, I think this is relevant to the point about Folkestone and Hythe themselves, that the approach remains a brownfield first approach, and that there were existing local plan allocations on the edge of Folkestone and Hythe, and indeed there was no doubt potential for further SCHLA work or infill studies to address those opportunities as well. And so obviously the ACOM study was in that wider context. It wasn't so much of to some extent, it was a kind of, it was a starting point in the sense that it was a sort of top-down look, but it wasn't necessarily a starting point as in there was no previous context, because of course there was. And that's why that's why there are obviously there's still a focus on brownfield opportunities. In terms of how the ACOM work looked at opportunities, what Adrian says is correct. We looked carefully at capacity of relevant infrastructure, including transport infrastructure and other utilities, for example, infrastructure. We convened a workshop where utilities providers and other statutory consultees were invited to provide their views on where growth could go based on the opportunities present, as well as the constraints. And that workshop was a helpful way of kind of validating and testing our emerging conclusions. But it's important to note that the workshop was held before we came to any firm conclusions. So the conclusions were informed by the workshops. The workshop, we didn't come to the conclusions and only then invite people to validate them. Mm-hmm. Adrian has also mentioned that we did look at indices of multiple deprivation in terms of opportunities for regeneration on the rather broad spatial and strategic assumption that the more deprived an area is, the more likely it is to stand to gain from economic and social regeneration that new development can offer, and indeed environmental as well.
Thank you. Just sort of turning back to sort of the infrastructure point in the workshop, what were some of the key sort of outcomes from some of those discussions with infrastructure providers, and how did you sort of take those into account specifically?
Okay, so the workshop, if you see the report, you'll see that the workshop came up with fairly similar conclusions to our own study, and that was helpful because we were hoping that our conclusions would have been come to by any sort of realistic neutral assessor. That was the aim, to be kind of independent and technical and impartial. In terms of the infrastructure opportunities, there's obviously quite a lot of detail in the report, but to give you some examples, I could just turn to, I'll just have a look at the details in the report, which is on page 492 of the report. And just to turn to the review of what the workshop conclusions on infrastructure specifically were. the workshop participants agreed that partly as a result of the M20 and the good transport infrastructure, that Area 4 was by far the most commonly selected location considered most suitable for new development. More than 7 times an exercise was held where sort of blocks, you may have seen these exercises, blocks representing a certain amount of new development, we invited them to place them. And more than 7 times more houses were placed within Area 4, which is the M20 corridor, than in any of the other areas. And certainly, I think the infrastructure in terms of transport there was a key factor in that. But regeneration was almost certainly a secondary consideration as well.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think what I'm sort of trying to get to is just sort of how sort of when those infrastructure providers were making their inputs to the plan, not only through the workshop, but more generally through the process of building up the strategy, is how their particular capacity has ultimately shaped what we see in front of us in terms of SS1 and how that's come about. So I think you've answered some of my queries there. But you did start to sort of touch on transport. And again, I'm sort of mindful that you've indicated that this didn't start with a complete blank sheet of paper, but we are obviously examining a plan that, whilst the policy context has some very distinct similarities to that from 2013, it is ultimately a policy that's been submitted in a fresh plan for us to examine. And what I'm trying to get a flavour of is how have the major transport connections within the district influenced that overall strategy, and particularly the positioning of Folkestone, where potentially a new settlement might sit within that overall spatial context.
The council might be better placed to answer some of the specifics of transport than I am, because our study didn't do detailed transport modelling, but certainly, as I've said, transport was a key spatial opportunity and also constraint that was considered at a strategic level. Just to add to my further point, I should also point out that while there were utilities providers who identified opportunities, both in terms of transport and other infrastructure, that was outside Area 4, of course, the providers weren't necessarily speaking from a purely planning policy point of view. They might have been looking at more an operational point of view. And so in some cases, they will have identified opportunities that were unfortunately within the AONB or within flood zone 3 or within internationally protected nature areas. So it is important to point out that the relatively freewheeling conclusions, perhaps, of some of the workshop participants on infrastructure and utilities, including transport, did have to be squared with planning policy, of course, because it's a planning policy document. Sorry, a planning evidence document that informs policy.
Thank you. Don't know if Mr. Tofts wanted to come in at that point. It was just around how those transport connections have influenced and the overall strategy.
Yeah, the transport connections have been one of the key factors in the overall strategy. As Jesse has said, it's been a process of kind of sieving down, looking at the whole district and then looking at different areas. And of course, sitting behind this is the transport modelling by AECOM that my colleagues spoke about yesterday. So it has been one of the factors that has influenced our choice of strategic distribution of growth.
So I suppose to follow up on that, how has it influenced the growth?
It's influenced the growth because its capacity has directed development to the North Downs area, where there was transport capacity at the broad scale. Other areas within the district, which were felt to be well connected in transport terms, as were mentioned, are heavily constrained by other factors, or are substantially built up themselves with little additional capacity for the growth.
So in essence, what you're saying is that some of the areas where there's potentially the greatest level of capacity are equally some of the most constrained in terms of landscape and environment. Is that essentially what's?
Yeah, I meant if we're talking about transport terms, the report did find that areas such as Romney Marsh were relatively constrained in transport terms, but areas such as Folkestone, for example, benefited from very good transport links, but then they didn't have the capacity beyond the capacity we've identified through the local plan, which was going on in parallel with this process. So it's a mixture of sort of environmental constraints and transport constraints.
Thank you. Sort of following on from what I'd call the constraints side of the discussion and capacity. In terms of the overall strategy, then, how have sort of movement patterns in terms of the location of jobs and homes fed into the evolution of the spatial strategy?
This has been a consideration from the start, and the ACOM work looks at opportunities for employment and other factors in a sort of holistic way, and then this has been sort of filtered down to the more local level, and sitting behind it has been the ACOM transport modelling work, which has looked in finer detail at the results coming from the sort of top tier of the study.
Thank you. So in terms of the strategy overall, then, is the strategy ultimately seeking to maintain the existing levels of self-containment in terms of commuting patterns across the district, or is it seeking to do something different? I appreciate the point around that this is a sort of an evolution of a policy from 2013, but obviously things change between then and now. So what is that overall approach in terms of commuting patterns?
The spatial strategy has been to create a self-contained movement patterns wherever possible, and the opportunities identified through the growth options work for a new settlement have provided opportunities for that, really. So yeah.
Okay, but to that end, obviously the new settlement is obviously what I sort of want to understand is what the overall, I suppose, balance between jobs and homes is as part of this overall district-wide spatial strategy. And I think I'm just trying to sort of really get a flavour as to how all of this is sort of hangs together as a cohesive sort of evidence for the district-wide strategy, really.
In terms of jobs, we have had separate work done by Litchfields, which I know we're coming on to in other sessions. So that sort of shows the balance between jobs and homes throughout the district. And as I said, the overall approach has been to have a self-contained strategy that minimises out commuting.
But in terms of minimising, is it effectively seeking to keep levels where they are now, or is it seeking to effectively enhance the level of self-containment beyond what is in the present situation?
Can I bring in my colleague who has led on the transport work at this point? James Hammond. Yeah.
Sorry, sir, you'll have to forgive me here. You have to repeat the question. I didn't have my headset on, so I wasn't actively engaged.
That's okay. Yeah, what I was trying to sort of understand was, is the plan effectively trying to maintain the level of self-containment that exists presently, or is it trying to further minimise that through its overall approach?
So we touched on this yesterday during Matter 2. So regards to self-containment and job creation, the garden settlement creates a real step change opportunity for quality business space, employment space within the garden settlement itself. And so there is a typical district average profile for self-containment in terms of how employment flows move around. But the garden settlement should improve upon that trend. So the level of self-containment attributable to the garden settlement will be greater than the typical district strategy, typical district average. So overall, as with any garden settlement, there is an expectation of, if there's quality space provided in terms of employment opportunities, etc., then there'll be a high degree of self-containment and other supporting service jobs. So, for example, on-site education, other healthcare, and supporting services. So not every job will be full-time equivalent. There will be a good spread of different employment opportunities.
Thank you, Mr. Helm.
Okay. And at this stage, it's purely anecdotal, but it's relevant to the conversation to a degree, that the government has consulted recently on free ports, and Dover Port has put forward a bid for free port status. Part of that bid involves collaboration across East Kent authorities, and the District Council was part of that conversation. Dover Port itself is constrained by its own geography and also other factors such as its highway network. So the free ports opportunity will come forward under what's called a hub and spoke model. So Dover Port will be the hub, and then outlying areas will present themselves as the spoke opportunities and support. And so it's realistic that there could be opportunity within Folkestone Hythe district to support the free port model, as an example, if it were to be to come forward as a commitment. So that whilst we can't plan for that outcome because it's still out to consultation, it gives a flavour that the district's position relative to the M20 corridor provides these other organic or other opportunities that might otherwise come forward.
Thank you, Mr. Hound. Mr. Honey, I can see a hand. I presume you want to come in on that point as well.
Yes, thank you, sir. Just to amplify what Mr. Hammond said, and to come back to my previous point about the ACOM study not, necessarily replacing any sort of brownfield first option, but just to state that clearly the limited space to expand in Folkestone and Hythe, naturally means that new jobs in Folkestone and Hythe can only be a certain type of job. And really, if you were wanting to diversify the job base and widen employment opportunities across the borough, then really, greenfield growth, it was fairly clear from the study, would be the only option to do so.
And finally, sir, if I may, just to tie everything together, and it's helpful that Mr. Honey is on today's call. Back in July 2015, ACOM prepared a study titled Land at Junction 11 M20 Advice Note. So the purpose of that study was to begin scoping out options for future employment growth and such like. So that really set the framework of what then became the policy approach.
That's helpful. Thank you, Mr. Hammond. Okay, that was probably a good opportunity to invite any points on this particular part of the agenda from participants. So I'm expecting my screen to be lit up with lots of little blue hands. Or does anyone have any points? No, I'm very surprised. Okay. Oh, Dr. Scoffham. I see. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, coming as an outsider and listening to the extraordinary detail and the huge amount of work that's gone into the background to the inquiry, I salute that, and I fully understand the enormous difficulties that everybody faces, because what we're talking about is what growth can be accommodated in a confined area, and I think that confined area is not just the Dover district, the Folkestone district. We need to look at East Kent, or indeed the UK generally. But that word constraints is a particularly interesting one at the present time, because in a way we're all constrained. Within 25 miles of here, since the core strategy was first hatched in 2013, we've got plans for a huge solar park at Faversham, at Cleve Hill. We've got plans and discussions around freight air traffic in Thanet. We've got proposals for the Goodwin Sands, which will have huge implications for marine life. We've got a development plan for Lyddon Circuit on the borders between all the areas and within the AONOB. We've got the Ashford Lorry Park and all the other things which might happen around the M20 and so on, and Otterpool. What is the stopping point? What do we say when people around here are very clear that enough is enough and that this area cannot accommodate anything else? And that's quite clear from the discussion that you've been having this morning and we're part of. I appreciate that we've got national guidelines to look at, but I appreciate also that we need to be looking for a balance. And I suppose the inputs which I'm going to be making this morning are about that idea of balance. And I think maybe that balance has been lost in the report and in the foundations on which it's based. Now, Susan Priest yesterday reminded us quite rightly that I think she said environmental constraints can't be used to ignore development needs. And I think that's quite right, and I understand where we're coming from on that, but I want to turn that round and say that housing needs can't be used to override environmental constraints either, and that we are in a situation where we know that we've got to actually think differently. Now, I don't know what the consultation has been, but one of my questions is, to what extent have young people meaningfully been involved in how their views represented in this planning document? And if not, why not? And that's not a frivolous question. If you look at the Welsh government, the government of Wales have a Future Generations Act passed in 2015, and that puts sustainability at the heart of decision making in Wales. And this feeds into national discussions, and at Westminster at the moment there are discussions around sustainability and the way in which future generations can be catered for. The national planning framework, which is, we'll come to no doubt and come back to that, uses sustainability at the very beginning in paragraph 7, and it uses the Brundtland definition about the needs of future generations. This plan is a plan for the future. It's a plan for future generations. Have future generations been involved in it? So I've got some questions about the basis of what we're doing, and that sort of focuses on the real difficulty of accommodating growth at a time when we know that further growth is very, very difficult to accommodate. We're looking for prosperity. The Future Generation Act in Wales has a new definition of prosperity, which is a very interesting one, which again seeks to balance this incredibly difficult thing between development and environment. Now, whether you want to, and whether it's possible to factor this into this discussion, I don't know. But if we can't, then I don't know quite what we're trying to do, because we're producing a blueprint for the future, and we need to look at what that future could actually be and how we can get there in a way which isn't going to undermine our ecological base to the extent that we actually cannot go on as we are. And we know that we're in a very difficult position globally. And if you look at anything, the statements on a national level, whether it's the Secretary General of the United Nations saying the planet is broken, whether it's Rowan Williams, the ex-Archbishop, talking about the existential threats. I'm not going to dwell on this, but actually we face very serious issues about how we can actually go on living as we are within the economic system that we've got. And that's where I come back to the incredibly difficult job which I think the local officials have been doing, and I salute them in trying to get there. But that's what I wanted to say about the foundations of the report and the difficulties that we're facing, and whether we can actually factor that in some way in improving and developing a report in a situation which is constantly evolving.
Thank you, Dr. Scoffin, for your input. I mean, just on the point around the consultation, we did have the discussion yesterday under the procedural matters around how the consultation had been carried out, and how the council went about following its statement of community involvement in preparing this plan. I don't know if the council had any further follow-up points that they wanted to make on Dr. Scoffham's points before we move on.
Just in to make some very general points, in terms of sustainability, we do have to follow what's in the National Planning Policy Framework, which puts forward 3 strands of economic, environmental and social benefit, and we've tried to secure all those 3 strands through proposals for the new garden settlement. In terms of consultation, we did a series of workshops across the district to try and shape the strategy, and in putting forward the document, it is very difficult to please everybody who may have a stake in it. I vividly remember doing a workshop in New Romney, I think it was, where we had many people through the door saying they didn't want any development in New Romney, and why are we always building more houses? And then I remember at the end, as we were packing up, there was a lady who came up to me and said that she was a resident in the area and her children couldn't afford to live in the area, and why weren't we as a council building more houses? So as a local planning authority putting forward this document, it is very difficult to please all the parties around the table, and so that's all I just wanted to add by way of comment.
Thank you, Mr. Toffs. I saw Mr. Honey coming next. If you had a brief sort of follow-up point, because we have, I think we started to sort of verge into a discussion around alternative options, which was the next sort of point on the agenda. But Mr. Honey, briefly.
Yeah, thank you, sir. And just to echo what Mr. Toff said and to respond to Dr. Scoffham, it's absolutely true that balancing, these 3 elements of economic, social and environmental development is absolutely critical. And when you were talking, Dr. Scoffham, at some points you said the report and at other points you said the plan. So I'm not quite sure if you're referring to the local plan itself that's being examined or the ACOM report. But I just thought it was worth pointing out that both parts of the report, both part 1 and part 2, we used the MPPF 12 key principles, as was at the time, to guide all of our decision making or judgments. And so that, I hope, was what we were able to do in the context of our report.
Thank you, Stanley. Dr. Scoffham, have you got an additional point on that briefly, if you could? And I want to bring in Ms. Miller.
No, I think maybe we can pick up the points later on. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. I've got Ms. Miller.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Dr. Scoffham, I think, started to introduce points of environmental constraint, which is obviously the reason why I'm sat around the table today. You'll have seen from our Regulation 19 response that the Kent Downs AONB unit remains very concerned that the district spatial strategy places too much emphasis on the North Downs area, with much of the new growth proposed within this local area. We are concerned that insufficient regard has been paid to the impacts on the setting of the Kent Downs AONB. While we recognise that the AONB itself is largely protected from large-scale development, the vast majority of the new growth has been directed to this area, and because of the scale of it, we think that the impacts on the AONB are so great, and they just can't be satisfactorily mitigated. We feel that insufficient regard has been paid to that and to the importance assigned to both AONB and its setting in national planning policy. So that's the basis for our fundamental concerns about the spatial strategy.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think it's fair to say we are going to be returning to those points in much further detail as we continue through both the agenda and the later hearing sessions as well. I've got Miss Carmody Morgan.
Yes, thank you, sir. I just wanted to come back on a few of the points that have been raised by participants so far. I just wanted to note that the landscape-led settlement in this location, as set out in Policy SS1, would enable Folkestone High District to meet their housing requirements in an effective and sustainable way. And I think you'll have seen the Council's evidence base shows that strategic scale development in this location is appropriate. I do believe that Otterpool Park will develop a sustainable community. It'll provide over 40% of the site as green space, promote sustainable patterns of travel, for example, walkable neighbourhoods, and that will be complemented by an extensive network of cycle routes. We're promoting water efficiency, renewables and low carbon technology, and hoping to deliver 20% biodiversity net gain across the site. And so I also wanted to pick up briefly on the AONB point. I know that we'll come back to that in detail in further sessions, but I just wanted to flag that the landscape and visual impact assessment we submitted as part of our outline planning application did consider such effects in detail. Even though we don't fall within the AONB, we do know we're very much within its setting. But that concluded that whilst there would be adverse effects upon some visual receptors, the changes wouldn't be dominating or overbearing and would only occupy a narrow proportion of such scenes. And also, where there are views from the North Downs, settlements often contribute to such scenes, and I think that's a view set out also in the AONB management plan. And where there are residual adverse effects still occurring, it's possible that these can be suitably mitigated with design principles. So yeah, I just wanted to make those points in response. Thank you.
Thank you. I can see some further hands up. So hopefully these points are we don't have too much sort of to and fro on things that we're going to get into a considerable amount of detail on in further sessions. But Miss Miller, you have another point.
But yeah, I know your point that we'll be discussing this in further detail subsequently, but maybe just some very high-level comments on Miss Carmody-Morgan's response, which is just, I think our feeling is that just because the policy includes the words landscape-led development in it doesn't mean that it is a truly landscape-led scheme, but I suspect we'll be talking more about this in the detailed policies. But in terms of the overall impacts as assessed in the high-level landscape appraisal and the growth options report, and also the LVIA that was submitted in support of the outline planning application, both ourselves and Natural England as government's advisors on landscape disagree very strongly with the conclusions of those reports that there wouldn't be an acceptable harm on the AONB, with Natural England considering the scale of development not capable of satisfactorily being mitigated. So I think that's an important point to raise, and it's a shame that Natural England aren't here to join in this discussion, but I know that they wrote to you back in July raising those specific points. So yeah, maybe we can discuss this in a bit more detail further down the line, but I just wanted to get those points out there. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for flagging those now. Ms. Barton.
Yes, I mean, following up on a number of speakers, I mean, this is, and I'm sure we're going to cover this, we are going to cover this further down the track, but and also in particular following up from Dr. Scoffin, I mean, this is an issue of scale. Only about 40, I mean, I totally take on board points about the AONB and the impact it will have, but the new Otterpool Park development is only going to provide about 40% of the housing in this period, and the rest of it is going to come from elsewhere. And if you look at the makeup, a lot of that is going to be foisted on some of the other areas which have major constraints, which includes Romney Marsh. So it is a major problem that the sheer scale of the number of houses that are coming into the area have all sorts of implications, not only for the AONB, but for other areas like Romney Marsh, which just can't cope with this level of housing. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've probably now started to stray into the next point on the agenda. So if everyone's content, I'm going to move on to the discussion around alternative options. Now, I set a question for the council as part of our matters, issues and questions, which were the alternative options considered, and the council's very helpfully sort of set out its position to a point on that, and we've just obviously discussed the overall approach. But what I again want to get to the bottom of is, we talked a little bit about the initial stage 1 report, and in particular some of the options that came through some of the early sort of workshop and testing. So what I want to understand from the council's perspective is what different approaches were considered as part of finalising the approach to the spatial strategy. Don't know who's going to lead on. Is that Mr. Tofts again?
Yes, I think as my colleague Mr. Honey has said earlier, it was a sense check on the growth options report, stage 1, really, to test what was emerging from it. And I think that sense check, which was had participants from utilities companies and neighbouring authorities and a series of other participants, very much pointed in the direction that the report finally went to, which was that we are a highly constrained district, and large areas of the Romney Marsh are constrained by high flood risk, and international sites of biodiversity value. Existing areas of the district are built up, Folkestone and Hythe, and have their own particular environmental constraints and areas of landscape value and open space. And in the North Downs area, a large part is within the Kent Downs area of outstanding natural beauty, where significant development should only be as an exception. So this was very much pointing in one direction, and the growth options work and the workshop was a further confirmation of that conclusion.
Thank you, Mr. Doss. Yes, I was interested in those sort of 7 approaches that were set out in that document. I mean, were these did these actually form part of reasonable alternative options as part of the sustainability appraisal? i.e., were they tested further, or were they effectively parked and discounted at the end of that study?
They weren't tested further. They were a sense check on the study itself, and sustainability appraisal carried on the policies of the plan throughout that process.
So was there a particular rationale for not sort of looking at those as reasonable alternatives then? Were they unreasonable and in effect not taking it from that side of things?
Yeah, part of the rationale was that many of them were against national planning policy and weren't reasonable alternatives to the strategy that emerged through the study. So, for example, one of the options looked at whether there was potential for further growth of a freestanding settlement in the Romney Marsh area, and that was discounted on flood risk grounds. So.
And there weren't any of those options that you thought were actually reasonable. They were all unreasonable. Is that correct?
Yes, none of them would have met the requirement for development in the district, and or have met national planning policy as regards AONB constraints or flood risk or whatever it might be.
Thank you, Mr. Toss. Mr. Sederavian, you have a hand.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, good, good. Yeah, just to take that one stage further, you referred to the essay quite properly. As Mr. Toff said, the conclusions of the high-level options report was that the great majority of the district, Folkestone, Hythe and its surrounding areas, Kent Downs, Romney Marsh, Walham Marsh, Lydd, New Romney and Dungeness, is unsuitable for strategic growth. And let's remember, we're dealing here with a core strategy review, seeking to accommodate a high level of new growth for the plan period, for the new plan period. It was found that Area 4, Sellinge and the surrounding area might have opportunities to accommodate strategic growth. And so that's why it was taken forward. So highly constrained areas which could not accept growth were discounted in favor of those areas which could sensibly be considered for further growth. So if one then goes to look at the essay, and I'm not going to go through it in detail because I'm sure you've been through it, but just to remind ourselves what the essay does. In chapter 6, it appraises the high level growth options, looks at Kent Downs, Folkestone and surrounding area, Hythe, etc., the 6 areas, and then refines it in looking at approaches to high level growth options. They've been appraised. And then there's a summary in chapter 6 of the findings for the 6 character areas. So this is that lovely expression, iterative process. So this is what the essay process has done. And of course, the final essay is a culmination of a lot of work that has started before Regulation 18 stage. So if we then have a views expressed about those character areas and the findings of the essay, and then the essay looks at the findings for the character area 4 sub-areas. But more importantly, having identified the Sellinge area as the area for growth, it then in chapter 7 appraises the spatial options available at Otterpool and Sellinge as a means of accommodating that growth. So the further options are then considered within these areas and refined as we go, having regard to constraints, and the scoring having regard to essay objectives, which are set out in table 7.2. So that's the way in which alternatives were identified, refined, and assessed.
Thank you, Mr. Chederavian, for that. That was very helpful. So I think we sort of discussed earlier in the agenda sort of the approach around sort of settlements and looking at sort of self-containment and things like that. And you've obviously set out the overall approach very succinctly there, Mr. Chederavian. Were any other options sort of considered that sought to maintain a particular settlement's position in the hierarchy, or seek to elevate any particular settlement's position or otherwise?
Nothing was elevated, and I think I know we're going to come on to consider the settlement hierarchy, but of course there's one which has been inserted into that hierarchy which wasn't there before.
Indeed. Thank you. Ms. Miller.
Thank you. It was just to respond to some of the points about the sustainability appraisal, because we have concerns that the assessment against the landscape objective is based on statements and findings of the growth options report and the high level landscape appraisal, which we strongly disagree with. For example, in the sustainability appraisal at paragraph 6.53, it advises that while some of sub-area B forms part of the setting of the AONB, portions of sub-area B have been identified as capable of accommodating strategic development without the need for extensive landscape mitigation, and therefore a minor negative effect was predicted. But as we've set out in our Regulation 19 response, we just think that's a wholly inappropriate assessment to have concluded. There's extreme intervisibility between parts of the site which aren't identified within those ACOM reports, which are in fact extremely visible. So I suppose it's just to raise the point that we think that the SA conclusions have been made in respect of incorrect assessments within those growth reports and landscape appraisals.
Thank you. Did the council want to respond to what they've just heard from Ms. Miller?
Yeah, I haven't got the paragraph in front of me at the moment, but just to say that, you know, in our view, the high-level landscape appraisal, the growth options part 1 and the growth options part 2 drills down to a lot of detail of the area. It looks at the whole district. It then looks at the area around Sellinge, and then that is further subdivided into a number of different areas. And then even within that, there is separate assessments of sub-areas within those sub-areas, looking at intervisibility within the AONB, looking at things like screening by hedgerows or tree belts, and the impact of things like tranquility, the M20 and the high-speed 1 rail corridor, and also opportunities for enhancements such as the removal of grandstands as part of a future development, or improvements to landscaping and road junctions. So while I haven't got the paragraph in front of me, I think you can have confidence that it did look in extraordinary detail at constraints and opportunities across the whole district.
Thank you, Mr. Tofts. Mr. Honey.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I just wasn't quite clear from Ms. Miller's comments there if she was saying that the SA misquoted the ACOM report or if there was a flaw in the ACOM report originally. So it'd be good to have that clarification. Just before I do get that clarification, I just wanted to point out that and we're talking now about the conclusion of the Part 2 ACOM report, made it very, very clear, very, very careful to distinguish between 2 types of suitability for development. There was suitability for development without extensive landscape mitigation being needed. And then in the more visible areas of the AONB setting, that the recommendation was only for strategic development that had significant landscape mitigation. So I just wanted to clarify that, and also just check whether Ms. Miller was referring to the SA or the ACOM report having a problem.
Ms. Miller, if you could just clarify that.
Yeah, so our issue is that the SA doesn't misquote the ACOM report, but it relies on conclusions from the ACOM reports that we disagree with. And following on from that, in response to Mr. Honey's comments that different parts of the site have been identified for strategic scale development or strategic scale development requiring substantial landscape mitigation, both the AONB unit and Natural England disagree with the findings of those reports and are concerned that certain areas that have been earmarked for development not requiring mitigation are in fact highly visible from the Kent Downs AONB. So it's concerns with the conclusions on landscape impacts from the AONB within those ACOM reports.
Thank you. Are there any further points that anyone wants to raise at this point in relation to the alternative options considered? No? Okay, well, in that case, we'll move to the next sort of bullet down on the agenda in terms of we've probably actually covered a fair bit of this ground in actual fact, in terms of the overall approach that was chosen. But I want to now sort of start looking at the overall quantum of development in each of the locations across the district. So how has the council determined the quantum of development to be identified in each of the key locations across the district?
It has been through this kind of sets the overall spatial strategy for the district. As we've talked about earlier this morning, the work of ACOM and the growth options was pointing very much in one direction to the Sellinge area. At the same time, we're aware that there is a lot happening within the district in terms of other sites. We have, in parallel with this, we have been working on the Places and Policies local plan, and that has looked at sites throughout the district. And so that forms part of the housing land supply for this core strategy review. We continued the Places and Policies local plan in parallel with this, and it was adopted September this year. So we have, through that process, undertaken thorough assessments of sites, and that forms part of the background. And should other sites, windfall sites, come forward, then they will be determined against the policies of this plan and also the local plan.
Thank you. What I wanted to just ask a brief question on is, we talked a lot about sort of the overall strategy and the position of Folkestone. I just want to explore a little bit about the new settlement and its potential impact on Folkestone. I suppose what I want to understand is whether there's effectively, does it play a complementary role, or is there potential for competition between a new settlement and Folkestone in terms of the hierarchy?
It is intended very much to form a complementary role, and we talked on the first day about duty to cooperate, and this was an issue raised by Ashford Borough Council and others, and so we are proposing modifications to policies to reinforce that we aren't seeking any development that would try and take retail development away from Folkestone or other centres within the district, or places like Ashford or Dover, and that is written into the policies of the plan. So it has been very much the idea that this will be a complementary centre within the district.
Thank you. So moving on, what I also want to understand is the role of the Lydd Airport and how this has been taken into account in developing the spatial strategy.
Yes, I think we have a representative from Lydd Airport here. Lydd Airport is looking at its future, and we as a council have been trying to work with them to help them in that process. They are, my understanding is they are in quite early days in that process, and so it was our view that one way to tackle that would be through an area action plan for the airport, so that as they develop their plans and as this comes forward, then that it could be properly tested and subject to proper consultation through that process. So hence the addition to the final paragraph of that policy. As we have gone on, discussions are continuing with the airport, and their concern, as you will have seen from their representations, is that their view is that the development of an action area plan, their view is it could possibly delay smaller proposals for the site, and so we are working with them to try and suggest to you an agreed form of wording that could accommodate their points.
Thank you, Mr. Dostie. I mean, I've got some further sort of points I want to sort of raise in relation to some of that sort of a little bit further down the agenda under main sort of item 2 SS3. So, but I can see a hand up from Miss Barton. So now's probably a good time to bring her in, Miss Barton.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was assuming this is going to be referred to tomorrow, but and you may be going to prefer to further down the road with SS3. But what I take umbrage with is the wording that says, we're looking, proposals come forward to the further expansion of Lydd Airport at Lydd. Now, this is completely ridiculous because Lydd Airport has the authority given in 2013 to increase its runway, to expand its runway, and to build a new terminal. Now, they they haven't physically expanded the runway. All they've done is thrown in a few poles to make it look as though to satisfy the planning obligations. I mean, if they are, and we are in 2020, 7 years post the application being determined, and still nothing has happened. So I think if a policy is to be made, the policy has to be whether or not there is a plan for the replacement for that site, replacement work on that site. There's nothing to stop Lydd Airport from taking companies to come down, and there's plenty of land around about. In fact, part of the submission made by the airport at the time was that we shouldn't only look at the 500,000 passengers per annum that are going to come into the airport. We should look at the other smaller companies would come to complement the airport, or complementary businesses that would come into the airport. Now, there's nothing to stop that from happening at the moment. So this has to be much clearer. There is no need for further expansion of Lydd Airport because Lydd Airport hasn't even begun the expansion under its existing planning application. The amount of activity now is lower than it was when the planning application was actually made. So to talk about further expansion of Lydd Airport, it's a question of whether the site is going to be repurposed for something else. The whole point of this, it has to be honest. To be talking about further expansion of Lydd Airport, I mean, they were looking at taking it to phase 2 to 2 million passengers per annum. Well, we haven't even got past 100. We don't even have 100 passengers per year now. So the whole thing is rather perverse. So the policy has to be very honest. Does Lydd Airport want to not remain an airport, or does it want to be repurposed as something else? I mean, this is a sort of halfway hash, so let's hedge our bets. It has to be a lot more refined and give a true indication of what is likely to happen. I mean, it's very unlikely, given COVID, that they're ever going to expand the airport. As an airport, it will continue to be a small local airport with the helicopter rescue service being there, and anything else will have to be something in addition. So the actual policy has to be very honest about what is being applied for.
Thank you. I'd like to bring in Ms. Chase on behalf of the airport at this point before I perhaps return to the council. Ms. Chase.
Morning. Yes, thank you. Yes, Victoria Chase, working on behalf of the airport at WSP. We were planning on discussing this further tomorrow afternoon in the hearing sessions, but just to touch upon what has been mentioned, and particularly on what Ms. Barton has mentioned. The airport is looking at continuing to operate as an airport. They are extremely ambitious in the future. We have had a change in management. We've got a new manager for the airport, Mr. David Hainsworth, who is joining me tomorrow afternoon, who has got some ambitions moving forward for the airport, and particularly moving forward the runway and the turn building. There are still some land ownership discussions that are still taking place with the Thompson land. So that is still happening, and that has been an ongoing process, granted slower than we would have liked, but it still is ongoing. We've worked quite closely with the council over the last few months to amend this policy to allow for Lydd Airport to expand in an appropriate manner. We think that the area action plan allows us to put forward our short-term, term prospects for the airport, and it allows us to have a separate document assessed separately. So I think on that basis, David Hainsworth has been in communication with a number of people moving forward since he's been instructed, so he can move on these ambitions that he has in the short, medium and long term. We think that the area action plan is a positive way to have these elements assessed appropriately. Thank you.
Thank you. Did the council want to respond to any of the points that have just been made?
Yes, sir. The problem for the plan is that in order to appropriately assess in environmental and other terms any major proposals that might come forward, one has to know what they are. So they can be assessed as part of the plan process. Having regard to the constraints, particularly in that area, one can imagine how important it will be for the purposes of both the SA and the HRA. In the absence of any concrete proposals, one can signal in the policy and the plan that there will be cooperation, nodding to the fact that an area action plan will provide the framework and detail sufficient to look at the sustainability of the proposal and its impacts through the HRA in due course when those proposals come forward. But the policy at the moment doesn't preclude anything coming forward. It is neutral in that respect, but does state the council's willingness to work with the promoters should proposals come forward. In the meantime, recognising its current role within the sub-region, we are proposing amendments to the policy which allow small-scale operational development to take place, subject, of course, to satisfying the habitats regulations.
Thank you. Are these changes you've indicated sort of still subject of the discussion that's just been referred to?
Yeah, I think we're just about at agreement, and we'll be in a position then to upload them onto the examination website as soon as we've got it checked and finished.
Yeah, my question is, I'm mindful that we've got a session tomorrow afternoon on the Marsh area, and obviously myself and other participants are going to need sufficient time to consider anything. So
I'm hoping it will be very shortly this afternoon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, well, as I say, we're going to be sort of coming back to it. Ms. Barton, I can see your hand. We are going to be coming back to some of that, not only under my sort of second bullet point two, but also tomorrow. So have you got a further sort of final point on that now?
All I want to do is to make sure, confirm that we will get notification of those changes before the end of today. Is that what we'll send, Mr. Shibet?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, and I'll also make sure that Caroline, who may have hopefully tuned in the background, will make sure that anyone who's participating tomorrow is also actively informed of that if it's going to feature in the discussion as well.
Indeed.
Yes, I've made an action plan note, so I'll make sure they're up as soon as I get hold of them.
Thank you. Okay, what I wanted to do is just sort of move towards a point that we haven't really discussed in a huge amount of detail, but again, keeping it at a relatively high level, in terms of the overall preferred approach, what I'm keen to understand is how viability has been taken into account in developing the preferred approach. And by that, what I'm seeking an understanding of is, obviously, the strategy introduces a significant new community within the district. So what I'm trying to understand is how overall district-wide viability has played a role in shaping that strategy. So is the majority of growth in an area that is essentially viable, or what might be the issues in that regard?
Viability work has informed the plan throughout, both the other policies plus also the garden settlement policies. As I said this morning, the evidence base is pointing very much in one area, but we are mindful that the development needs to be delivered, and so the viability evidence produced by Gerald Eve has demonstrated that, we believe. At the same time, there were requests from yourself, sir, for viability work of the existing policies in the plan for Folkestone Seafront, Shorncliffe Garrison and New Romney, and I'm sure they will focus on some of the points on later discussions, really.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's fair to say we are going to be returning to that in greater detail, but I just wanted to get an understanding of how that's informed the strategy overall and the preferred approach taken in the plan. Unless there's any further points on what we've just discussed, I want to move on to just briefly, I'm mindful of time, I've got a couple more points on the first sort of substantive item on the agenda. So if we can work through those, and then perhaps we'll take a short break after 11. So I wanted to move just briefly on to the approach to previously developed land in policies sort of SS1 and SS3. And again, I think really it's sort of linked to the viability point we've just discussed. Obviously, the plan quite rightly takes a positive approach towards previously developed land, but how does this affect the overall deliverability and viability of what's effectively proposed to remain the principal settlement in respect of sort of Folkestone?
We don't, from the viability work, we don't believe there are any viability problems that would prevent the sites coming forward. As part of the housing land supply matters, you will see that we have had discussions with landowners and promoters, and in terms of local plan sites, for example, the great majority of those are moving forward. Many have development on them, and a large number have planning permissions granted for them. So we have no evidence that viability problems are preventing the development of sites, whether that's in Folkestone Hythe area or lower value areas in the Romney Marsh, or higher value areas in the North Downs.
Thank you, Mr. Toft. I didn't have any other further points on sort of viability in those terms. Does anyone else have any points in that regard that they wish to raise now? No? Okay. I just wanted to briefly touch on one or two aspects elsewhere in SS1, really, in respect of the character areas. What I really wanted to get into was, are the strategic priorities for each of the character areas sufficiently clear in terms of the role of economic growth in particular? I'll sort of start with that point if I can. I think I just wanted to, as I say, get a flavour. do those policies go far enough in terms of supporting economic growth, I suppose, is what's underlying the question to help you.
Yeah, we feel they are positive policies for not just for the North Downs area, but for the remaining the urban areas and the Romney Marsh areas that would promote economic growth across the district. And there are other policies in the plan and in the places and policies local plan as well that would promote economic growth and make employment land allocations throughout the district. So we believe those are positive policies that will not constrain the economic development potential of the district.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's important because these three character areas and this approach effectively are some of the key building blocks from which a large parts of the rest of the core strategy sort of flow out from. So I think in setting the overall tone for what follows in the plan, I think that's sort of what I'm trying to get at. And sort of in supplement to that question really was, are each of the priorities sufficiently clear about how development outside the identified settlements in each of those areas is to be addressed? On the basis that each of those areas sort of focuses on some of the some of the key settlements, but does it provide enough guidance as to what might happen in terms of development outside of those key places in each of the character areas?
I think outside of most of the settlements of those character areas, there would be various constraints that would apply. In the Romney Marsh area, as we talked about earlier, the high flood risk covers a lot of the area. There are the sites for international biodiversity value. In the urban area, there are also a number of constraints that would influence the pattern of development. The places and policies local plan as well has more detailed policies on economic development and the treatment of economic development opportunities outside settlement boundaries. So we feel the suite of policies of the development plan as a whole gives sufficient direction for any planning application that would come forward outside of any settlement.
Thank you. Mr. Honey.
Thank you, sir. I just thought very briefly it was worth just reminding anyone who wasn't previously aware or making them aware that obviously with the conclusions of the ACOM report channeling strategic growth towards Area 4, it is very clear in the report that it is covering strategic growth only. And so, of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that non-strategic growth wouldn't be suitable in other more rural character areas to the extent that it's possible to support it through national and local policy. And of course, that means appropriate economic opportunities as well, which I'm sure the council will have considered, but just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any wider points on those particular matters that were just discussed? I had one very small other minor point. I think I've also potentially spotted a typo in your submitted policy because you refer to table 4.3, the settlement hierarchy. Did you mean 4.4, which is going to be the subject of discussion a little bit later on this morning?
It is 4.4.
Make a note of that one. Splendid. As we've sort of principally come to the end of the sort of main part one of the agenda, I think now would be a good opportunity as we are approaching 11 o'clock to take a break, and we've all been on screen for a fair while. So I propose that we have perhaps a 30-minute break before we resume for the second part, looking at SS3 in terms of place shaping and sustainable settlements strategy. So if that's okay with everyone, what we'll do is we'll break now and start again at 11:30. And obviously just remember to stay logged into the meeting, but obviously turn cameras and microphones off. Okay.
Yeah, just to confirm that the session will stay live, so if you could just mute and take your video down, that would be appreciated.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome back. The session for Matter 4 is resumed. I think we've got everyone that we're expecting, so we'll carry on in earnest. We sort of moved on to the sort of second main part of the agenda in relation to policy SS3. And the sort of first aspect I wanted to ask a few questions on was around the settlement hierarchy. Now, I mean, I suppose in summary, sort of policy SS3 provides sort of further criteria about how the council will consider development proposals as they come forward and how they've got to demonstrate how they've been selected in relation to the hierarchy. But obviously what we've got is a situation where we've got 6 different categories of a settlement hierarchy: the sub-regional town, strategic town, service centres, rural centres, primary villages, secondary villages. And I would assume that everywhere else outwith of that is going to be the countryside. What I sort of want to understand a bit is how each of the settlements was selected for placement within each of the different typologies of settlements in the hierarchy. Who's going to kick off for the council in this regard? Mr. Tofts,
yeah, thank you, sir. Yeah, the settlement hierarchy in the plan was carried forward from the 2013 core strategy, and that had an evidence base sitting behind it, including the rural services study and the strategic distribution report. And that categorized the various settlements into their categories. We are a rural area. As we talked about earlier this morning, there are some quite remote rural areas within the district, so there are a number of different categories which address those areas, but also we have large towns like Folkestone and also Hythe. So the categories were developed to accommodate the different characteristics of settlements within the district. As time has gone on, we have monitored these through our annual monitoring report and through looking at commercial space and shop fronts, and we believe that the categories set out there remain relevant and appropriate for the district. You know, given that the previous core strategy was adopted in 2013.
But am I right in saying that evidence, if you're relying on that evidence base from 2013, that I don't recall seeing that in the evidence library as part of this examination? Did you resubmit the settlement strategy paper, and is it the rural? Forgive me, my note taking missed the full name of the rural paper.
I would need to check. It's referred to in our statement on Main Matter 4 at paragraph 1.55.
It's been referred to, but I don't recall seeing that in the library anywhere. If I've missed it, my apologies, but I'm not sure that those documents were submitted. I don't think I've got much in terms of. I'm looking at the library now. Apologies, everyone. I believe this is what in radio terms is termed as dead air while I'm scrolling through a web page, which I'll try and keep to a minimum. I think the point I'd probably make is I think what I'd appreciate is if someone could ensure that is placed in the library, because ultimately if it is evidence based that you're relying on as part of the justification for the settlement hierarchy, it ought to be available in the evidence as part of this examination.
Yes, certainly so, yeah.
Because I think it's sort of germane to sort of some of my queries, because what I've been trying to unpick is I appreciate the overall point you've made in terms of you've rolled forward a lot of this work, but obviously you said that monitoring has taken place and you don't think there's any changes. But having sort of looked in detail at the strategy, there have been some moves in relation to what was put forward in 2013. So, for example, I think Stanford has been moved down to a secondary village. Is that correct? It wasn't previously such.
Yeah, that's to take account of the proposals for the new garden town in the plan, and also with Western Hanger as well, given that the new garden town would form its own kind of line in the hierarchy with New Romney and Hythe. So
Yeah.
those changes were made to accommodate that proposal.
And in terms of what you just said, in terms of that evidence, is obviously that wouldn't have been included if you were simply rolling forward the 2013 documentation, because obviously that's a change as part of this plan. Is that right?
That's correct. That is a change as part of this plan. Yes.
Okay. I mean, I think it would be helpful if some of that could be documented in some succinct manner, just to be clear in terms of the approach you've taken, because obviously there are clearly changes there. So I think some short addendum to that document as part of admitting it into this examination would probably address my concern in that regard.
Yes, we can certainly do that, sir. Yeah.
And I think, ultimately the placing of the settlements, comes down to a planning judgment of the council, but obviously that does need to be set in the context of an evidence base, and that's ultimately why I think that change is necessary. Obviously, if there are any implications of any of those changes for sustainability appraisal, then clearly those would need to be picked up. I can see Mr. Shadow Revian's hand.
Yeah, so I think if one looks at the evidence base library for this examination, I think right at the bottom, there's a box which says evidence-based documents that support the core strategy 2013. So I presume it's in that cache of documents.
Is that formal? Is that just another page on the website, or is that a formal part of the examination library?
Well, that's a good question. All I see here is a purple box stating that the evidence-based documents that support the core strategy is available by clicking on it. I just thought I'd bring that to your attention, that's all.
Thank you. I think it needs to be formally brought into the examination library with an appropriate reference, and obviously bearing in mind that there are changes to it, although they are not massive changes to that document. A brief update to explain the position of why various elements have moved would assist, because obviously that is the evidence base you're relying on. So
okay,
that needs to be done.
We can do that, of course.
Yeah, so I think as I said, I think I was just tail ending that point with, obviously, if there are any implications for the sustainability appraisal, you need to be aware of those as part of that discussion. But in essence, what you're saying is that there haven't been any, other than the matter relating to the villages around with the new settlement in terms of Stanford and Western Hanger. Those have altered. The settlement hierarchy remains unchanged. So I'm also presuming on that basis you're going to tell me, Mr. Thompson, correct me if I'm wrong, that because you haven't updated that document, or your monitoring doesn't indicate any other sort of levels of local services and facilities that would originally have led to the placing of some of those locations in the hierarchy haven't changed. So I just want to understand the position of what sort of local services and facilities might be between 2013 and now.
Yes, we're not aware of any major changes that would lead to a reordering of the settlements in that hierarchy. There have been some general trends overall. For example, the closure of ATM points and those kinds of things, but we're not aware of any particular changes to any one settlement that would mean that it should move up or down in that hierarchy.
Thank you, Mr. Toffs. Mr. Waterhouse, you have a hand raised. Do you want to come in at this point?
Yeah, thank you, sir. I mean, the evidence base to the settlement hierarchy, it seems to me to be the 2011 rural town study. It's 2011 Rural Services Study. And there was an associated appendix to a cabinet report looking at strategic distribution at that time. So that was 9 or 10 years ago. The core strategy was then adopted in 2013, and the strategy laid out in that core strategy has been implemented to a large extent. And what we've got here is a very significant change to the spatial strategy in the district. Back in, as the evidence base was undertaken in 2011, it was envisaged that circa 62% of the growth would be going to Folkestone and Hythe wards, 16% to the North Downs area, and 22% to the Bromley Marsh area. And what we're actually getting now is a much greater concentration of growth in the North Downs area, in the sort of Sellindge and surrounding area. And there's a very major, very significant, very decent study been undertaken by ACOM to justify that. And I think that my issue with this is that since that study was undertaken, there's been significant growth. There's in the process of 250 homes being delivered at Sellindge, for example. And it's not just homes that have been delivered. Because this has been subject to 21st century master planning, there are new sustainable communities that have been created. There is new village infrastructure that's been delivered and continues to be delivered and continues to be planned for. And it's appropriate to look again at these settlements and how they're structured, because they're very different to how they were in 2011. And taking the example of Sellindge, which has been identified principally as perhaps the most sustainable location in the district to locate growth. It's now increased from 250 homes to 600 homes. There's a new village green, there's an upgrade of a primary school, there's expansion of the surgery, new sports facilities, replacement village hall, new commercial development. And this settlement now is going to have a very strong symbiotic spatial relationship with Otterpool Park, where there's going to be significant new recreation infrastructure, a new secondary school, enhanced connectivity to a railway station, which is a major sustainability change, new walking and cycling infrastructure. And so we've seen a major shift in the spatial approach. And that's not really been reflected in the ranking of Sellindge, which remains a rural centre in this study. And I don't believe that 600 homes and all the associated community infrastructure that goes with that is consistent with its position as a rural centre. And I think that my biggest problem with all of this is that when I look back through the evidence and I look at the sustainability study, sustainability appraisal, and I look at the ACOM study, the amount of growth that's been assigned to Sellindge at 600 homes has been, at least to some extent, Paris 7.3 of the sustainability appraisal would suggest, restricted based on its position within the settlement hierarchy. And that was fixed and established back in 2011.
Thank you, Mr. Waterhouse. Yes, I'd like the council to respond to some of those points, if you can. So, Mr. Tofts.
Yes, in terms of the rural centre, the description does say they are designed to provide shops and services for a significant number of residents, visitors, and for other villages. But we feel there is still quite a significant step up between those centres and the higher centres in the hierarchy, such as Lydd and Hawkinge. And for example, if you look at numbers of properties served, there is quite a big gap between those two levels of the hierarchy. So we believe that even with the recent growth there has been in Sellindge, it fits within that hierarchy, and its description does allow it to serve a significant number of visitors and residents from neighbouring places.
Thank you. Mr. Waterhouse, you wanted to come back in at that point.
Yeah, I mean, the other settlements within that tier of the settlements hierarchy haven't got 600 homes attributed to them and all the associated community infrastructure that goes with that. That they remain consistent with the previous strategy. The main change, the main reason why there is a core strategy review is that the spatial strategy is shifting, and the nucleus of that area is our part focused around Otterpool and to some extent around Sellindge. Those numbers aren't reflected at the other tiers in the settlement hierarchy. I also feel that the 600 figure that's been assigned to Sellindge has been influenced and affected by its historical position within that settlement hierarchy. The number of up to 600 dwellings that is in that policy seems to have to some extent been derived by its position within the settlement hierarchy.
Thank you. I don't know if the council wants to respond at that point, but I think there's some further matters sort of on this that I wanted to explore in a bit more detail, and we're probably going to sort of end up straying across the sort of next bullet point in terms of the scale of development, because I think what I'm trying to sort of gain a feel from is overall the plan sufficiently clear about the scale of development, particularly at each tier in the settlement hierarchy. Because I think, as Mr. Waterhouse has highlighted, there are clearly some differences between places within the hierarchy, but also is the plan sort of upfront enough about the quantum of development that each of those particular tiers, bearing in mind their respective strategic roles, is likely to receive?
We consider the policy and the tiered hierarchy is sufficiently clear. It sets out the role of each of the settlements within the hierarchy. It is for other policies in the development plan to set out more detailed criteria by which sites would be assessed. But we don't think there is anything in there that would, for example, prevent development at rural centres or service centres or any of those within the constraints that we have highlighted earlier in this session.
Yes, I sort of understand that point, but I suppose what I'm saying, should the settlement hierarchy be clearer overall as to the quantum that's identified in each place? Should it be more specific?
I don't think it is, and it's never been the intention of the plan to set aside a certain percentage of development, for example, to each of the settlements within that hierarchy. I think, as I said this morning, the evidence is very much pointing in the direction of Sellindge and the surrounding area, and other opportunities as they come forward will be judged against other policies of the development plan and the settlement's place in that hierarchy. But we don't think it would be appropriate to assign a certain number of homes to each of these strategic tiers or settlements within that tier.
So you're saying that essentially the reason behind that is, in light of the constraints, it has to be based on a more individual assessment of what those locations could accommodate, rather than a more sort of strategic approach, setting out percentages or giving particular targets, for want of a better phrase, to each of those locations. I think you might still have your mute on, Mr. Toft, if that's you to respond.
Yes, that's correct. Where opportunities arise and where the constraints are, as we've discussed this morning, it is a very constrained district. But we feel within those constraints, the settlement hierarchy provides a useful way to look at the settlements and cater for their future growth.
Okay. I've got a flurry of hands, so I'll start working through those in order. Ms. Barton, you had your hand up first. You want to come in at this point?
First, I'd like to correct Mr. Waterhouse. 10% of the housing is to go to Romney Marsh, not 20%. Since I'm very interested in scale, I thought I should correct that. But my issue is I don't have any problem with the broad hierarchy, but I do have a problem with the allocation of a New Romney. Can I just refer you to the council's response to question 2? It talks about it was talking about the work they did on the various areas and lead New Romney and Dungeness, and basically the sentence is the report concludes that as the Area 5, the lead New Romney and Dungeness area is unsuitable for strategic growth, and that the past approach of non-strategic development focused on meeting local needs will continue to be appropriate into the future. Yet, if you look at table 4.4, New Romneys is classified on a par with the New Garden settlement. Now, this is a new town. This is a gung-ho development, basically, and it's talking about to accommodate significant development. Now, that's totally contrary to the evidence base that the council has used to support to actually assess the various areas. I don't have any problem with New Romney being the centre of Romney Marsh. It is the prime focus for development, but to actually put it in with this supporting verbiage that says to accommodate significant development is totally out of context with the local environment and the constraints this whole area faces. I mean, New Romney was built on a slight mound in the middle of Romney Marsh, but that mound has been used up, and we're now straying into high flood risk areas. So it should be. It's acknowledged that it should be the centre of, or the prime economic focus of Romney Marsh, but it can't be on a par with the New Garden settlement, and I would argue similarly high. The New Garden settlement should be a totally separate allocation in its own right. I mean, every developer is going to come in here and just say, well, look, you're saying to accommodate significant development, and that will just be a green light to unsustainable development. So in my view, that New Romney is not correctly allocated in this hierarchy.
Thank you, Ms. Parson.
The reasons actually pointed out in the supporting evidence from the council.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Mr. Waterhouse to come in at this point, and then I'll come back to the council. I see my colleague Mr. Ward has a question, and we'll come back to him at that point. So, Ms. Carmody-Morgan. Oh, sorry, Mr. Waterhouse first. Yep.
Thanks, sir. Mr. Toft says that the settlement hierarchy doesn't restrict the amount of growth at a specific settlement, but in combination with the sites, with the policies for settlements, it does do that. The Sellindge policy as drafted says up to 600 dwellings, and that puts a restriction on the amount of development coming forward at Sellindge. And the sustainability appraisal for the plan would suggest that 600 maximum figure was derived and emanated from its position within the settlement hierarchy. So that's the practical effect of the two policies when table 4.4 SS3 and CSD9 when read together. And just on responding to Ms. Barton, yes, I do recognise that the core strategy policy does seek to focus around 10% of the growth to the Romney Marsh. But when this key evidence-based document was produced at the time in 2011, it was assuming that 22% of the growth in the district would be heading to the Romney Marsh.
Thank you, Mr. Waterhouse. Ms. Carmody-Morgan.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to add to the council's views, but from an Otterpool Park perspective, in that we do consider the spatial strategy and the settlement hierarchy in the plan will be effective. Sustainable development at the new settlement and the way the hierarchy is written reduces the risk of unplanned impromptu growth in other areas of the district, allowing the LPA to be more in control. And it provides an effective and efficient approach to providing sustainable infrastructure rather than trying to retrofit existing towns unnecessarily. Thank you.
Thank you. So just sort of coming back to the council, obviously you've had a range of points there in terms of consideration of the new settlement as effectively a separate tier in the hierarchy of itself. And obviously you've heard Mr. Waterhouse's comments. Could I just have your views on those points, please?
It remains our view that that's an appropriate place in the hierarchy. The alternative would have been to create a separate tier or a different description, but we feel it is broadly equivalent. In terms of New Romney, that was partly a function of the existing strategic site, which was allocated there in the 2013 core strategy, which is currently being built out and which is the subject of a discussion in tomorrow's session, really.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Ward, you have a question.
Thank you. Yeah, just following up on that, putting a couple of questions to the council, particularly in relation to how sellage is dealt with in the hierarchy and the policy approach. I suppose the first point is, the first question rather, is in terms of policy SS3, the paragraph in the policy refers to Part A, sorry, the proposed use, scale and impact of development should be proportionate and consistent with the settlement status and its identified strategic role, see table 4.4. I'm just wondering how you view the practical implementation of that aspect of the policy, specifically in terms of it distinguishing between what you've identified as a service centre and what you've identified as a rural centre. So in practical terms, how is that categorization going to affect the scale of development, given that the policy is not associated with targets, as it were, for each particular settlement? So how in practice is there going to be a distinction made between a service centre and a rural centre, first of all?
It's intended as a general sort of strategic policy to govern development. And so each plan application would need to be judged on its merits, but it's also bearing in mind that it's not necessarily housing we might be talking about in terms of what may be judged against the policy. So it might be employment opportunities or retail or community facilities. So it is to try and match those various forms of development to the appropriate tier in the hierarchy by cross-referencing to that table and the character and role of the settlements within it. It is the intention behind the policy.
I appreciate that, but in terms of the practical implementation, so you may well be faced with a planning application for some housing development or employment development or other forms of development. How would a judgment be made about whether that's an appropriate scale or not at that level in the hierarchy between a service centre and a rural centre?
It sort of comes back to the role of sustainability, really, and for any housing development, would it be a sustainable development in terms of would the services and facilities that it needs be there to accommodate it? So it's an intention to direct the development to the most sustainable tier in the hierarchy, in that it has the services and facilities and transport networks to accommodate it. So it will be a judgment based on those criteria and other criteria in the development plan.
Yeah, I'm just interested for your views as to how that judgment would be calibrated in effect, you know, in terms of when's the tipping point between an appropriate scale of development and an inappropriate scale of development. Are you effectively saying that every case has to be dealt with on its own merits, and there would be in effect an assessment at the time as to what an appropriate scale of development would be in that particular settlement?
Yes, it would be an assessment against this policy and against other policies in the plan, you know, for example, which try to encourage sustainable patterns of development, or in the places and policies local plan, we have a number of policies dealing with town centres and village centres, and there are defined boundaries within those policies. So it is taking the development plan as a whole, and this being a strategic overarching policy to deliver those aims.
So you mentioned boundaries there. So in terms of settlement boundaries or development limits, that's a tool that you would use to advise those decisions. Is that right?
That would be one tool alongside the other policies in the development plan. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Just a second question for you. Again, in relation to Sellindge, we have policy CSD9, which we'll come on to talk about in detail in later sessions. But I suppose the point here is that if you take the core strategy review, it specifically identifies Sellindge, and it specifically has a policy, a strategic policy about it, unlike any other settlement lower down in the hierarchy. So it does seem to be the council's made a distinction between Sellindge and other smaller settlements. It's actively promoting, allocating development in Sellindge. It has as I say, has a strategic policy relating to it. So does that not lend weight to the argument that it should be regarded as a service centre, given that you've got a specific policy about it?
It was our view that given the hierarchy and the scale of the next tier up, so to speak, that you know, even with the policy CSD9 for Sellindge, it didn't tip it up into the next tier, which serves larger and wider areas.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ward. I can see Ms. Barton, your hand is raised. Do you want to make a point on this?
Yes. In relation to the point Mr. Ward made, could you outline exactly the practical implications of applying the strategic towns between New Romney and the New Garden settlement when you have texts such as to accommodate significant development? I mean, I just don't see that. I mean, I understand what you're saying in terms of where they lie strategically, but that seems to me to be a green light for very, very significant development. And I'm not sure how, without more specific wording, that there will not be a distinction between New Romney and the New Garden settlement. It seems to me, I'll get back to this point, that the New Garden settlement should be an entirely separate category, or there should be some text added to the strategic town text, say, to accommodate significant development insofar as consistent with local constraints or something like that, adding local constraints as well as maintaining historic character. There has to be something in there, because I think on a practical level, you may, it might be the intention of council for that to be this hierarchy, but in practical terms, most developers will just see it as a green light for significant development, and there's not enough distinction between New Romney Town and the new Garden Settlement. They'll be put on a par. The New Garden Settlement is a new town. I mean, it's going to be focused on very, very high growth. New Romney Town has very, very significant constraints.
Thank you, Ms. Barton. Yes, I think I'd like the council to come back on that. But what I'm sort of keen to understand is some of the justification for effectively leaving sort of New Romney there based on, I suppose, again, this principle that you sort of rolled forward a lot of this from 2013, and that was based on New Romney's broad location. And at that point, there was a particular quantum of development that was to be identified. And I suppose where I'm going with this is that obviously since then, part of that broad location has been built out. There is a quantum remaining, and we'll come on to that in future sessions. But I'm just trying to understand some of the reasons for that placing and the language that's been used in table 4.4 in relation to Ms. Barton's point. So can you just sort of respond to those matters for me, Mr. Tofts?
Yes, it is partly as a result of the strategic allocation for New Romney, which is currently being built out, but also to recognise that the kinds of development that may be being judged against the policy are other forms of development, for example, town centre development or employment or whatever it might be. So yeah, it was to try and arrange the settlements of the district into a rational hierarchy, subject to their opportunities and constraints.
Thank you. Yes, I think there are certainly some potential issues with how some of this wording, and I can see some of those tensions exercised in that table. But I think we're going to have to take that away and think about it. But I can see Mr. Waterhouse wants to come in at this point, so now would be a good opportunity for you to make any further points, Mr. Waterhouse.
Yeah, it was just in response to the next tier up, the service centres, which I think are Lydd and Hawkinge. I mean, if you take Hawkinge and the planned infrastructure and facilities that would be at Sellindge, arguably Sellindge would have greater service provision than Hawkinge, and I think that was what was a main driver for establishing the settlement hierarchy in the first place. If you look at the 2011 rural villages study, it was looking at the number of the type of facilities and infrastructure that was at each location, which I think is a sound approach. But I also feel that in looking at settlement hierarchies, I think you have to look at the linkages between settlements that have strong spatial relationships, and in this instance, the emerging spatial strategy for the district is going to create a very strong symbiotic relationship and synergy between Sellindge and Otterpool Park, and that the facilities and infrastructure of the two settlements will be able to be utilised by residents in both locations.
Thank you, Mr. Waterhouse. Yes, I think, as I said, I think that there are some potential issues in relation to some of the placements of these settlements within the hierarchy. And obviously I have asked for the evidence base that's been relied on to be placed in the examination library, and where appropriate, an update, particularly in relation to anything containing services and facilities. And I think that's obviously going to be important that work is done. I can see Mr. Shadowreeving's hand, so to come in at this point.
As I read the discussion and the nature of the questions being asked, it seems to me there are two issues that need to be addressed, or which you are wanting to be addressed. One of those is the position of the villages and towns within the hierarchy, whether they're placed appropriately. The second is whether, as a policy tool, combined with the use of this hierarchy, policy SS3 is effective as worded, principally by reference to paragraph A. So consideration needs to be given, one, to whether or not the locations are appropriately located within the hierarchy, and secondly, whether policy SS3 could be made more effective. Is that my understanding?
That is a very accurate understanding, Mr. Shettery.
Right. Well, we'll certainly consider that further, most certainly.
Yes, and I think this is a matter we're perhaps going to have to revisit, and in many ways we are going to come back to some of the more detailed points on each of the sessions as part of the dedicated sessions on the character areas, but we may also have to have a further revision just in respect of settlement hierarchy at some point.
We may need a further session on this for further discussion, perhaps.
Because, yeah, that's a matter for myself and my colleague to
Of course, absolutely.
Thank you. Now, I did sort of moving. Did anyone else have any other final points on this before we sort of move on a little further? I think we've probably had a fairly good exploration of some of these points. I don't see any hands. Now, I did have some questions further in relation to the approach to Lydd Airport, but obviously mindful of the point that was raised this morning, is that there is a document that is shortly about to be produced, which I haven't yet had sight of and had a chance to digest, nor have participants. So it may be more productive to perhaps have more of that discussion tomorrow at the session on New Romney. I believe everyone who's got an interest in the airport is also here today and is coming tomorrow. Can I just confirm that's the case?
Sorry, I just raised my hand just to answer. Yes, that is the case. We'll be in the sessions tomorrow afternoon.
And Ms. Barden, you're on the agenda as well for tomorrow afternoon. So on that basis, it may be better to perhaps have the rest of that discussion. All I was going to sort of discuss at this point was in relation to again what the status of the position is in terms of planning permissions implemented or otherwise in terms of the airport. So we can pick those up tomorrow, and various matters are again on a similar theme about sort of clarity and quantums of development in relation to the airport. So I think perhaps we'll move on from that if everyone's agreed, and we'll visit that tomorrow afternoon. On that basis, my sort of next sort of query was sort of moving on slightly, just in terms of some more detailed points, just in relation to SS3. Excuse me, I'll just find my place marker. I had a brief question in relation to the approach, particularly in relation to sort of heritage assets. I just sort of noted that the policy relates to, I'm just going to move down to remind myself, part E of the policy, which talks about key historic features of conservation interest. And I'm just interested in what the council sort of means by this, and whether these are defined or whether these are anything different from the approach that's ultimately set out in national policy and in other legislation. Mr. Tofts, is that one for you?
Yes, it's what is intended by that is a kind of strategic reference to factors that would need to be taken into account by development through this policy. In terms of key historic features, we do have a heritage strategy for the district, which outlines key themes and features throughout the district. And also we have a number of policies in the Places and Policies local plan, which would be used to deal with the detail of any planning application for development that might come forward. So that is what is intended by that.
Thank you. Yes, I was just sort of briefly putting my section 78 inspector hat on. Is just what I suppose what I'm getting at is the terminology used in that part of SS3 consistent with the framework in terms of avoiding harm to significance of designated heritage assets, and thereby linking to the statutory duty in the Listed Building and Conservation Areas Act.
It is something perhaps that we could look at in more detail. I'm just trying to bring up the policies in the Places and Policies local plan, but my recollection is it's broadly in agreement with the strategy set out in those policies in terms of bringing back heritage assets into use, and we have within that a policy on the local list of heritage assets, and we also have reference to legislation and guidance covering heritage assets and need to preserve or enhance buildings and their setting, etc., if they're listed buildings, and preserving or enhancing the character or appearance of conservation areas.
Okay. I think it would be worth just if you can reflect on that. I think there may be some limited potential for a little bit of inconsistency to creep in. So I think it would be helpful if you can look at that again, just to.
Yeah, on retrospect and looking at it, it is perhaps could reflect more closely what's in the legislation in terms of preserving or enhancing.
Thank you, Mr. Scheller. Even you have a hand.
Yeah, what we don't want to do is simply restate legislation or government policy. So we'll certainly have a look at that to see whether the wording is in any way in conflict with statutory and policy requirements, and to make sure it's consistent with other development plan documents.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Scheller. Even appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now, I think as I say, in light of the fact that we're sort of perhaps taking some areas to pick up tomorrow. Now, I have a brief point in relation to within your statement, we had requested in relation to a main modification to SS3 on the specifics of flood risk assessments. I just wanted to make sure that we pick those up as part of the discussion here today. I'm just going to apologies for the, want for a better phrase, the dead air while I just find that in your statement.
And that, sir, is on page 24 of our statement for matter 4.
Your eyes are faster than mine. Yes, I mean, I think obviously this has emanated from discussions between yourselves and the Environment Agency. Is that right?
I think this was as a result of statement of common ground between Kent County Council and ourselves in their role as lead local flood authority.
That's so, right. Sorry. Yes, no, it's in there.
I think that they wanted the policy to refer to other sources of flood risk, yes. and so it was our suggested amendment to cover the points they had raised in.
Yes, I think, whilst we don't have a representative from the County Council here today, obviously in the matters where they have responsibility as the LLFA, then clearly the additional wording there would be needed in relation to the effectiveness of that policy to make sure those other types of flooding are picked up, particularly where they have a role to play. Thank you. I can see Mr. Ward has a hand up again. Mr. Ward, if you want.
Thank you. Just a specific question about criterion B in policy SS3. It starts off consideration of alternative options within the appropriate area should be evident. And it goes on to talk about a sequential approach. So I've got two particular points to raise about that part of the policy. The first point being the justification and the reasonableness of asking for alternative options to be considered on the basis that we are talking about development proposals which would in principle accord with the spatial strategy, so they would be in the right settlements, as it were. So just if you can give me the council's view as far as the justification for, in effect, requiring an applicant, a developer, to demonstrate how they've considered alternatives, first of all.
Yes, this is in relation to flood risks. So I think it was to look at development within each of the main character areas in terms of flood risks, so that, for example, further development in areas of high flood risk wouldn't be ruled out, but would need to demonstrate that it was sort of applicable within the character area, and it's sort of further elaborated on in bullet point C below.
Yeah, just in terms of what part B actually says, though, it doesn't, as I read it, doesn't limit that consideration of alternatives to cases where there may be flood risk. It goes on to talk about a sequential approach, and it gives an example in terms of flood risk. But as far as the principle of asking for alternatives to have been considered, if from what you've just said, it's the intention for that to only apply to flood risk cases, is that something that needs to be clarified in the policy wording, or is the intention a broader intention to look for alternative options to be considered for every issue?
No, I think there is probably some confusion between the two bullet points, and it was to look at the flood risk aspect within each of the character areas, the urban area, Romney Marsh and North Downs area, recognising that they have very, very different characteristics in terms of their flood risk. Okay.
So just to be clear, part B of the policy, it's effectively intended to just set the scene for flood risk and sequential assessments as far as flood risk is concerned. It's not intended to cover any other matter. It's just that it goes on to talk about, for example, to inform decisions. It suggests that there will be other matters to take into account.
Yes, that is the case, and there will be separate tests that would apply for retail, for example, looking at alternative options there. So perhaps on reflection, that could be made clearer.
Okay.
Sir, if I may, I think actually we need to take out the ambiguity from this policy quite clearly. This discussion reveals that there is room for confusion later on at DM stage. So give us the opportunity, please, if you would, to consider items B and C in the policy with a view to perhaps consolidating them, because of course the sequential test is inherent in any event when we do the flood risk assessment for a particular site. The other matter is whether or not B was intended to cover the need to carry out a sequential test for the development per se, other than in respect of flooding. It seems to me a very high task for an applicant to perform in relation to, say, a purely residential development with some supporting social infrastructure. But if one is looking at a major or substantial retail proposal, then of course one would want to make sure that the overarching policy deals with that and is consistent with other DM policies in the local plan.
Yeah.
So I think we do need to look at this.
Yeah.
And we need to come back on it.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah, I mean, just to confirm, I mean, as you just pointed out, it does create some confusion in terms of the intention of the policy. If it is the case that, I mean, the only two examples that we've referred to are flood risk and retailing, where a sequential approach would be applied. If it is genuinely the intention for that, for the policy to be limited to that in that sense, I suppose following on from that, asked a kind of bigger question is there a need for part B or most of it? Because in terms of the flood risk issue, the policy does go on to specifically talk about a sequential test in any case. It'd be interesting for you to consider whether retail policy is adequately already dealt with, for example, as part of the policies and places local plan. So I suppose the big question is have a think about whether that part of the policy is actually necessary just in any case. But certainly if you consider it is, you know, to look at how the ambiguity can be taken out of it.
What we'll do is look at the relationship between A, B, and C, and see how they can be better expressed to avoid the ambiguity.
That's helpful. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
That was it. Yeah.
Thank you. Ms. Barton, you wanted to make a point on this.
I mean, it's probably not valid in law, but one of the problems we have on Romney Marsh is that the sequential test is used and then the exceptions test is used, and so that development goes ahead. Now, shouldn't there be a more a stricter policy in a place like Romney Marsh, because it is a flood risk plain, and there obviously has to be some development, but we shouldn't always be overriding the exception with the overriding the sequential test. I said you shouldn't be doing it, but let's just do it anyway because we'll use the exception test because the social imperative is more important. Now, I thought the government was supposed to be becoming stricter on flood risk, and I wonder whether there should be a more nuanced approach to Romney Marsh, given the issues we have down here, because we can't always have things just being overridden. So I'd like to pose that maybe there should be something a little bit more detailed for this area.
Thank you. I mean, I think some of what you've just sort of said reflects ultimately on the approach set out in national policy and the tests that need to be applied at that level. And obviously, this plan, one of the tests that we are here to examine is obviously conformity with national policy in respect to the framework. So there will be a point at which that national policy overall sets the position. But I take your point, and I'm clear on it. Mr. Tofts, I don't know if you had any final points on anything you just heard that you want to make at this juncture.
I don't think so, sir. No. Just in terms of retail, there are a number of policies in the places and policies local plan, as you've said, that set out how those kinds of development will be dealt with.
Thank you. Dr. Scoffham, you have a hand raised. You have a point you want to make on this matter?
Yes, it is around the discussion that we've been having this morning. So I wonder if this is a good time to mention or to ask the question as to whether it would be useful within these policies at some place to recognise as we've talked an awful lot about constraints, we've talked an awful lot about sustainability, the Sustainable Development Goals. which, as it were, updates our understanding of sustainability and sustainable development, are something which we've adopted, the UK government has adopted, and they do provide a very useful policy framework. Is the scope for referring to the Sustainable Development Goals in a constructive way within the policies?
Thank you. Well, I'll ask the council to for any thoughts on that.
The plan itself has to respond to government policy. It has to be within the parameters set by the MPPF. So the question is whether or not the policies as drafted actually perform that function, rather than restating national policy. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but as I understood the question to be, that's my answer.
Thank you. I think that's I'm clear on the respective positions on that matter. So I'll invite any final comments before we close the session. Does anyone have anything else that they wanted to raise at this point before we close? Ms. Barton, final points. Oh, you're still muted, I think.
So are you talking about closing this particular point or closing the whole session?
Well, I've explored all of the matters in respect of policy too, and I was so if you have a specific point on the on anything you've just heard, but I was then going to do a final call for any comments that you needed to make that haven't been explored this morning so far.
If you feel point 6 is the core strategy review sufficiently clear in terms of the scale of development envisaged in different areas, settlements. I would like to argue that then it needs to be more specific in the old local and the old core strategy. It set out roughly targets of the proportion of housing that could go to each area. Now, the problem we have, as I pointed out in my response to the Regulation 19 changes, is that the overall numbers for housing haven't been taken down. The numbers from the Oshville Park have come down, and there's been a very significant increase in windfall allocations. And guess where they will go? They will go in Romney Marsh. In fact, if for the first 5 years, it's clear that Romney Marsh will be punching well above its weight in terms of its delivery within the 5-year plan. I'm sorry, within the 5-year land bank. But the problem is, I know we will not. Just history tells us that Romney Marsh, if we are producing houses, houses at a certain high rate in the first 5 years, it will not suddenly go down in the subsequent period of the plan. So what will happen is the plan will be updated after 5 years, and they'll forget about the fact that we've, rather than produced 10% of the houses, we've contributed 20%. It will start again. It will lock in those houses and then say, well, we've had this nice big allocation from Romney Marsh, let's continue. And there's nothing in the plan to stop this from continuing to happen. And I think there has to be some measure by which these very constrained areas, similar things that occurred in the previous plan, that gives some indication of the housing that should come from the Romney Marsh character area. And my second point is to do with the wording of SS. Sorry, a completely separate point. Oh yes, on the North Downs character area, and the last sentence, it says major developments will be refused within the AMB other than in exceptional circumstances, and where it can be demonstrated with the development of a. I mean, this seems completely. Forgive me, I'm Miss Miller. I'm maybe treading on your toes, but it seems surely that should be just major development will be refused within the A and B full stop. Because if you put other than in exceptional circumstances, it opens it up to large scale development. And we already had that with Dover District Council, and it was eventually stopped by the CPRE. It creates a huge amount of distress for local people. AONBs are supposed to be by their charter to have limited development, so why not just leave it like that? And if there are absolutely unbelievably exceptional circumstances, they can be written into the next plan. But it shouldn't be left open like that. It should be very precise. One of the problems we face is that local communities are dragged into all these legal battles because the local plan is not sufficiently clear. If that was there, major development will be refused within the AONB, full stop. Everyone knows where they stand. By putting on that additional sentence, it means that it opens up, makes it terribly ambiguous, and gives everyone the right to fight. And we end up with these huge wastes of money. Money being spent on things that would be better spent elsewhere. It is vitally important to keep everything very, very precise. So that's my last point. My previous point was to do with the fact that I do believe there should be something to make sure some of these very constrained areas are not used as the backstop for development, which has been the problem here. I know what will happen. Ardport Park won't deliver, and guess who will be responsible for delivering? We are the backstop area because the AONB is restricted, and the urban area, as you pointed out, is very restricted. So where can the development go? Onto Romney Marsh, the most illogical and unsustainable part of Folkestone and Hythe. So thank you. I'd like you to consider it.
Thank you. We will consider all of the points made. So I'm clear on what you've made. Unless the council has any further follow-up points on that. I mean, just in terms of the overall approach, obviously, there is still the backdrop of the National Planning Policy Framework, which does set out the national approach in respect of areas of outstanding natural beauty, and ultimately the council will always be in a position whereby this examination will need to look at the conformity of this plan against the framework. So I take your point and I understand it, and thank you for making it. So I had no further points on this morning's agenda that I wanted to raise. So I will ask for a final call for any final points that haven't been made so far. And I don't see a flurry of hands, in which case I'd like to thank everyone for their contributions this morning. It's been a very good session, and I've got lots of very useful information to take away. We've got a number of actions for parties to go away and have a think about and or do. And otherwise, for anyone I'm seeing this afternoon, look forward to seeing you after the break at 2 o'clock. And for those who aren't returning, thank you for your contributions. And otherwise, I shall now close the session.